So let's start with control and governance. And in talking about control and governance, what I want to do is start first with a basic taxonomy of the corporation and its core cohorts. Now, these may be a little bit different in an LLC, but generally speaking, you're going to find that LLCs track this general management and governance structure as well. So the concepts likely hold. For corporations, they absolutely hold. So, what do we have? We have at the top, stockholders. And then beneath stockholders, we have directors, your board of directors. And then beneath directors, we have officers. So what are we looking at here? Well, stockholders are your owners. So when you own shares in the company, shares that show up on the cap table, shares of stock, you are a stockholder or a shareholder. You are an owner. Now, that obviously is critical from a general economic perspective because we know that that means you have the opportunity to gather some winnings from an exit transaction, from a liquidity event, from an M&A transaction, an M&A deal. What does it mean from a control and governance perspective? Well, this comes as a surprise to a lot of people. But in the basic paradigm of the modern corporation, stockholders have very little say, very little control over the activities of the corporation. Generally speaking, stockholders get to vote on an M&A transaction, the sale of the company. And that makes sense. There's nothing more important facing a company than its very sale, okay? It's the moment of transition from this life to the next. And it makes sense that stockholders should have a say over that. You need to have their consent, their approval to sell the company, to convert these assets into cash. Okay, well, that's great and important, but you only sell a company once. So that's one issue, but it only shows up as it's an end-of-life decision. What else do stockholders get to vote on? Stockholders get to vote on amendments of the certificate of incorporation. Okay, well, what's that? That sounds kind of technical. Well, the certificate of incorporation, that's what it's called when it's filed in Delaware. If you're a corporation organized under the laws of another state, it's probably called articles of incorporation. But your certificate of incorporation is the basic document that you file with the Secretary of State of that particular state to breathe life into your entity. This is how it's actually literally formed. And it represents the Constitution of this company. It's why it's sometimes referred to as a charter document. The certificate of incorporation these days tends not to include very much information in terms of the purpose or the mission of the company. It used to, but we've washed a lot of that out. But what it does include that's essential is, and it usually shows up in Article 4 of these certificates of incorporation, it talks about the type of stock that's available for sale and issuance by the corporation. So it's going to talk about common shares and describe them, and it's going to talk about preferred shares and describe them. That's important. This is where you go. And here's what's interesting. These are publicly available. So if you want to go get the certificate of incorporation for any company, you can go do it. And you're going to see what it has to say about common shares and preferred shares. Now, anytime you amend this document, anytime you change it, you need stockholder approval. Kind of makes sense. It's the constitution of the corporation. These are the owners of the corporation. It's logical that they would have some say. When are you going to amend the certificate of incorporation? Well, not often. But generally speaking, you will amend it whenever you're raising money. Why? Well, when you're raising money, assuming you're selling preferred shares, you need to describe those preferred shares. And not only describe those preferred shares, you need to come up with a number of preferred shares that you're able to sell. And this is called the authorized shares. It's your cap. It's a kitty that represents the shares that you're able to sell, the maximum number that you can sell. This needs to be set forth in the certificate of incorporation. Anytime this changes, if you need to authorize more shares, if you need to sell more shares, if you need to sell a different kind of preferred share, you're going to have to amend your certificate of incorporation in order to do that. To amend your certificate of incorporation, you need a vote of the stockholders. Okay. So, at least indirectly, usually, when you're raising money, you're going to need to get a vote of the stockholders. Not necessarily because they get to vote on financings, but because they get to vote on the amendment of the certificate of incorporation. And we need to amend the certificate of incorporation if we are engaged in a financing because we need to sort of articulate the architecture of the preferred shares that we're going to sell. Okay. Well, that's important. It's pretty powerful. But you're not raising money every day. So sale of the company once, raising company from time to time. And that's pretty much it. Except that stockholders get to elect directors. And your directors are charged under corporate law with managing the day-to-day affairs and overseeing the day-to-day affairs of the corporation. And we'll talk about directors in a second. But all this being said, stockholders, in their capacity as stockholders, don't have a lot of say over the corporation and its conduct and the way that it's managed. Sale of the company, amendment of the certificate of incorporation, and then they get to elect these directors. Think about it as electing representatives to Congress. Yes, that's a meaningful act when you go to the voting booth and do that, but it's not like you've got input and say on what's happening and what's coming before these representatives on a day-to-day basis in Congress. You don't. In fact, it may be completely intransparent to you. So, not a lot of rights and privileges as stockholders. Investors know this. And as a consequence, they say to themselves, we're comfortable buying preferred shares. We're comfortable investing in this company. Not just comfortable, we're excited about it. Otherwise, why would we do it? But this isn't enough. And in fact, this is even exacerbated by the fact that, especially in the early days, investors are probably acquiring a minority interest in the company. A minority interest, less than 50%. So even on the things that go to a vote of the stockholders, they know they're going to lose because the founders and the people around the founders own a majority of the shares, more than 50%. So they're in a minority position and they only get to weigh in on precious few transactions. So they say, look, we recognize all of this, but we're going to bargain for, we're going to seek out some additional rights. And sometimes these are referred to as blocking rights. Sometimes they're referred to as veto rights. Sometimes they're referred to as negative covenants. In the actual certificate of incorporation itself, the terminology that you will see, the nomenclature that you will see is these will be referred to as protective provisions. So what are these things? What's a protective provision? Well, a protective provision is a specific act or action or transaction that the corporation cannot take without the approval of the holders of preferred shares. And it would be unusual to see it require unanimity. Usually it's a majority of the shares. We would refer to this as a majority in interest. So if there are 100 preferred shares, you would need the support of 51 of those shares. If one person owns 51 shares, that's good enough. We measure by shares, not by head. Okay? A majority in interest. But you can change that. You can fiddle around with it. And sometimes investors do. But the protective provisions will articulate, will lay out these acts and actions and transactions which can only take place with their approval. Now these tend to be material issues. They are organic, they are macro, they are big, they are important. So what would they be? Sale of the company. You can't sell the company without our approval. Amending the certificate of incorporation to raise more money. Can't do that without our approval. Distribute cash to the stockholders. Can't do that without our approval. Change the size and composition of the board. Can't do that without our approval. Take on debt beyond a certain amount. Can't do that without our approval. You will see, as you spend more time in this world, that there are 4, 5, or 6 protective provisions which essentially say what I've just described, very high-level stuff, which show up in every transaction. And they are there as by default. They're essentially boilerplate at this point. They're deemed to be so important and so material that it's appropriate, and the ecosystem recognizes this as being appropriate, that preferred shareholders should have this sort of say. Now, sometimes you'll see a list of protective provisions and it's 20 long, and obviously gets way deeper than what I just described. And what you have there is you have an investor who's saying, I need to have more influence over more matters inside this corporation outside the norm. Sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it's not appropriate. What I can tell you is that gets negotiated. But the basic ones that I described don't, they just are. And the idea here, to be clear, is that investors aren't saying, we want to exercise these rights. They're not saying, you know what we really want to do? We really want to exercise a veto. We really want to block a transaction. What sense does that make? Okay, they're looking to make money. They want to see these assets grow and blossom and develop into something interesting and lucrative that can be transacted for money, gross proceeds, and of which they'll have a piece when it's boiled down to net proceeds. They don't want to create friction. They don't want to throw sand in the gears. But what they do want is influence. And what they do want is management, the founders, the board, to pay attention to them. And they do that by wielding these protective provisions, the threat of the protective provisions, the threat of the blocking right, the threat of the veto right, the threat of the exercise of the negative covenant. The whole point is, we don't want to reach a point where the officers and the directors have cooked up a transaction that they then are going to take to the stockholders blindly and run the risk that the preferred stockholders are going to say, no, we're going to exercise our blocking rights. Instead, these groups know that these exist, and as a consequence, they get ahead of it, right? They say, okay, the preferred stockholders have some say over this particular transaction. We better bring them into the tent early. We better tell them what's going on. We better make sure that they feel loved. We better make sure that this is fully socialized with them. We better make sure they're on the same page. So that when it does come time to get their approval and consent, we know that it's a done deal. That's what you want. And that's what the preferred stockholders want. They just want to be included. And this is the way they do it, through the inclusion of protective provisions. That's unique, okay? Are there times where common stockholders have protective provisions? Sometimes, very rare. Preferred stockholders, though, all the time. It's routine, because they want this extra control right, this extra governance right.